Let's transition to the next session. I'd like to call up all the speakers for that session. We are going to also have one virtual. I'd also like to ask Graeme Reed, there he is. Graeme Reed is going to be the moderator for this session. He is the Senior Policy Advisor for the Assembly of First Nations, and he will introduce the session and the speakers. Thank you, Graeme.
Anin, Bojo, Graeme Reed, Ottawa, Nonjaba, Anishinaabe, and Makwa Dodem. It's an honor to join all of you. It's also an honor to pick up, I think, on that last thread that we just heard by transitioning a little bit to government policy and programs. And we have a very reputable group of speakers that are going to be able to share a little bit more about what that is. I wanted, though, to start just by acknowledging that the territory that we're on, Ta'an and Kwanlundun, and it's always such a blessing to be back in this territory. Acknowledge Pembina and Dave for putting this together. Also want to acknowledge the sacred fire that's ongoing and bringing our ancestors with us. Those who are joining in this room, those who are joining in the multi-purpose room, as well as those who are joining online, welcome. And I think it's an important conversation that we're going to have, and hopefully the way in which we're going to structure it is to at least leave a little bit more questions and continue this conversation through the course of the next couple days. So we structured it with kind of 3 rounds of questions, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. Some of those probably don't need any introduction, but we'll start, and it's going to do 3 rounds. We'll have a question with each of our panelists, including André Bernier, who's virtually joining us. We'll have a question for our government representatives, and then we'll have a question for our non-governmental representatives, and then hopefully have opportunities for conversations with all of you. So on the panel, we have Minister Streicker, who holds many portfolios, as I was reading yesterday, but potentially most notably the portfolio for energy, mines, and resources. André Bernier is joining us virtually. He's the DG of the Electricity Resources Branch. We have Anita Walker, who's Director of the REACH program. Both Linda and Chris, I don't think you necessarily need introductions, but really want to welcome them back to the stage for a conversation that I think is extremely important, and want to acknowledge Chief Dana and Judith for, I think, setting us in a good frame of mind for the conversation that we're about to have as it relates to the intersecting crises that we're seemingly facing, those with respect to climate, to biodiversity, also to health, as we navigate those for all of our families, but want to send all of you that. So with that, we're going to start with Minister Streicker, and I think he has a microphone with him. So Minister Streicker, in the plan, Our Clean Future, the Yukon government is committed to ensuring Yukoners have access to reliable, affordable, and renewable energy. Can you describe how this commitment came about and why it's an important priority for the government?
Thank you, Graeme. Hi, everybody. Before I get going, I just wanted to say I really appreciated Harold and Phil Gattensby yesterday in the Sacred Fire, and also the folks, I think, from Vancouver Island who sang. I really appreciated that. I thought it was a nice way to start things off. Graeme, you're asking why we're here, and I mean, you could answer this question so many ways, but I want to say, first of all, that I'm excited to be here because I'm an engineer, and my field of study has always been climate change, and in particular, the North. And I've been doing that for decades. And so I'm excited because, well, many of you in the audience today will have been people that have been advocating for some of this change for a long time. And it's good to be here because it's been a long journey to get to this point. It doesn't mean that we don't have a hard road in front of us and lots to do, but it is exciting that we are finally starting to transition to a more sustainable future. I think for the Yukon, for those of you who don't know, we have a bit of a grid, but if you talk to folks from the provinces, you know, that grid services 45,000 people or a little less, so they would think of that as a small town. So even the Yukon's grid, we could think as being a remote community. And certainly we have many communities that are dotted around that are not on that grid. And even if you are on the grid, in our territory, half of our energy use is for, oh, I gotta stop already? Okay, thank you, thanks. Half of our energy use is for transportation. So we're going to shift transportation and heat to renewables. So we've got to increase our renewables broadly. And do we need it to be reliable? Of course. Every community needs reliable energy. It's critical. No one would design a system that wasn't reliable. And do we need it to be affordable? Sure. I think that folks are willing to pay more for something that is sustainable, but it still needs to be affordable. And does it need to be renewable, green, sustainable? Absolutely. That's the whole point that we're trying to get to. So I'll give one small story and then I'll go before I hope I get the orange card. A decade ago or more, when the territory was starting to do this, they approached it by saying, hey, let's build these renewables, and they came up with renewable projects. And then afterwards, none of them flew. And I remember talking with people, I remember working with several of you on some of these projects. I said, no, we're going about it the wrong way. It has to start with the community. It has to start with, here it would be First Nations communities, and we need to approach them to see what they would like to do. And so that's how we're working now. And we have a whole bunch of different programs that welcome those types of projects to be initiated. But it's our belief that when the project comes from our First Nation governments, from our communities, that they will land well, and we should create the system to receive those and support those, not the system which says you're going to do this. So we're very excited right now. We've got a lot going on in the territory. I think you heard yesterday about the Atlan hydro project from the Taku River Tlingit. We've got a grid-scale battery going on up the hill here, which is partnered by Ta'an and Kwanlin Dun. And our big projects coming down the road will be with the Carcross-Tagish First Nation, where we try to get to pump storage. Because, of course, as you will all know, it's great to get renewables, but if we could get seasonal storage, that would make a huge difference for all of our communities. So I'll stop there, Graeme. Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's great, Miigwech, Minister Streicker, for that. And I think the focus on communities and also decolonizing government kind of leads us into our next round of conversations with André and Anita. And I don't know if André is with us virtually. I think so. But maybe we'll start with him and then we'll go to you, Anita. Okay, we'll start with Anita and then we'll go to André. So just picking up on that thread, a couple weeks ago there was the release of emissions reduction plan by the federal government, their plan to reduce emissions by 2030. One of the pieces in that was Indigenous climate leadership and the commitment to that, which to Minister Streicker's point is really about hopefully embedding responsibility and authority in community. And I wonder, Anita, if you could start just updating on what this means in practice and some of the work that you're doing.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. It's so great to be here. The time goes quickly, so I'm going to try and talk fast and get through all of this. I'm actually going to step back a little bit from the question and just give some history of how we have, I think, evolved and grown in our understanding of how to support Indigenous climate leadership well, and recognizing that right now we still have so far to go. So we're definitely in learning mode at this point. But I think some of you are familiar with the Northern Reach program that's supported by CERNAC. It was introduced in 2016. It was building on, I think, 15 years of clean energy programming at that point for Indigenous communities across the country. And in 2016, we decided to kind of break away from like the really traditional type of federal programming that we know is really complicated and challenging for communities to get access to. We usually put up all kinds of barriers to actually getting the funding into the hands of the people that really need it, that are going to make a difference on the ground. So with Northern Reach, our goal was to support northern communities, Indigenous communities in leading clean energy programs, renewables, energy efficiency, and building capacity at the local and the regional level. And we broke away from some of the traditional practices, throwing the calls for proposals out the window, so that communities could come when they were ready to take action on climate change. Introducing multi-year funding so that communities could plan years out instead of trying to only get funding 1 year at a time, and really building that local capacity. And I think the most significant change, trying to reframe the way that we were delivering the programming by putting communities at the center of the work and building relationships. So picking up the phone and really listening to what communities needed, what the opportunities were, and how we could support, what our role was as federal funders in supporting the amazing leadership and opportunities that were happening at the community level. And we've heard of some of that work already. I think we're going to hear a lot more through the day today. And I certainly can't compete with Chief Tizia Tram as he speaks about Indigenous leadership. I think it's very powerful. But what we've seen from these community projects across the North is just this amazing ability to lead and to innovate, and to be able to then take experiences from one community to another community and grow the work that's happening there. And so as Graeme mentioned, there have been commitments through the Strength and Climate Plan for the federal government to work to advance Indigenous climate leadership. And what does that mean? It means looking at the meaningful inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the development of climate policy. It means looking beyond all of the the abundant number of federal programs to say, how do we start to think about taking the money from federal programming and putting it in the hands of Indigenous peoples so that they can lead on climate change. And it means starting to support priorities, self-determined priorities that communities know are really the answer to clean energy. And so we were happy to see funding in the budget, and some of that work will get underway shortly. We'll be looking at co-development work around that, and what does that mean over the next few years? How do we move that forward? But in the meantime, there's work that we can be doing on how we're delivering programming to support Indigenous leadership better. And so this is work that we are engaging on with Natural Resources Canada, with Indigenous Services Canada, and other federal departments. André will talk about that a little bit more. But really looking at how do we change the way, not just getting the money out the door, not just what we fund, but how we fund communities. How do we change our relationship with communities so that we're supporting your priorities? And we know that these are not, clean energy projects are not just technical projects. They are really supporting community health and well-being. They're supporting economic reconciliation. These are transformational projects at the community level, and we want to be supporters of that. So maybe with that, I'll turn it over to André and let him go through some of the details.
Yeah, Anita, can we get André up on the screen?
Everyone, just making sure you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks, Anita, and I'm really sorry that I'm not able to join you in person. I'm at home right now. I've got COVID, so you're probably just as happy that I'm not there. Still glad that I'm able to make this connection with you virtually, which I'm doing so from my home in Ottawa, which is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So to situate myself, as Graeme said, at Natural Resources Canada, I oversee much of our electricity-related programming. So that includes, for example, the Clean Energy for Rural and Remote Communities program, so focused on helping rural and remote communities take on renewable energy projects, capacity building. We work really, really closely with Anita and her team. I want to talk more about that, but first, just don't want to miss this opportunity to salute the leadership of all of you who've been working in this space for a long time, including others on this panel there in the room. Although I'm focused on providing a federal perspective for this work, we know that there's been tremendous leadership shown in this area across the country, community leaders, rights holders, developers, governments, utility partners. So it's a privilege to be a part of this conversation and have the opportunity to work with people like all of you to move ideas forward. So in Anita's remarks, she really put the spotlight on the importance of supporting communities and community leadership, and I think that's a good starting point for looking at, from a federal perspective, how we see the road ahead. As you likely heard, yesterday federal ministers announced that the federal government would be investing $300 million towards capacity building, clean energy projects and such. So really building off the work of Northern Reach and the Clean Energy for Rural and Remote Communities program. That's not new. I mean, that announcement was out in the Strength and Climate Plan a little while back, but I think what's worth noting is, I think what is new is how we're working together. And Anita talked about some of the lessons that we've learned about what it takes to be a good partner and help with projects in this space. And administratively, the work that we're doing by bringing the efforts of my team and Anita's team and Indigenous Services Canada closer together is to streamline the approach, basically to make ourselves easier to work with, reduce overlap, make sure we're working efficiently. And that's internal work, so maybe a little bit interesting, but I think the significance is on what the effect that we hope that has for those that we're working with. Effectively trying to reorganize ourselves so that we can be better partners, more flexible partners. So we're not fully established yet as a unified effort. We're still in the process of staffing up. I would mention, by the way, if you get a chance to meet with Jeff Biggs, who is there from Natural Resources Canada, he is the new executive director who will oversee, from NRCan's perspective, much of this work. So please do introduce yourself to him if you haven't had the chance already. We expect later on this fall to be able to, I'd say, a fuller launch, and overall to be able to present something that will have more flexible funding support. And the goal is really to put communities at the center of the effort. So at the heart of it is that, working with communities, and that we realize it's a shared space. There are a lot of decision makers in that space. I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. But maybe just to stress a couple of quick points in conclusion. One, we've received a lot of feedback over the last few years on our programming and how to do our work. As we've looked at standing up this new effort, we've done our best to build that into our design. We know that classic federal programming, and Anita spoke to this, can be onerous and difficult to access, and we're trying to change that. And also that this is something that we see as a dialogue. We have a sense of what the path is ahead of us, but we're going to need to continue to adapt and learn, and picking up from the previous conversation, be willing to have courageous conversations. So thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of your conversation today.
Yeah, Miigwech, André, and Anita for sharing that. I think if anything, and linking it to the conversation we had with the panel last time, it really shows the work that government needs to do to change, to support Indigenous climate leadership, as opposed to what Indigenous governments need to do to change. So I'm going to shift gears and move to Chris. And in the last panel, Chris started a conversation about his journey, and I wonder if you could share how that journey has changed in the time in which you've been involved and some opportunities you see coming up on the horizon. And Chris always talks about where the puck is going. So I want to hear that, yeah.
But you got to say it right starting on two. You got to say it right, Graeme. You see, when hockey players, so starting Gretzky always said, you got to go where the puck is going. So you have to say, so where the puck are we going? That's how you got to say it. Right? You're the three things, and you know I always say three things. First of all, we have to go to affordable heat. Everyone goes to renewable power, which is a part of it, but go to affordable heat. And CERC is great. I do think we need something similar with the same scale of resources. 300 million sounds like a nice number each year, so we can get to every Indigenous house being energy efficient and safe. So that's the first thing I put on the table. And in the context of the three things I'm going to say, they really need to be whole community. One of the things I've learned, I started doing this work 25, 30 years ago, and I've learned that with a remote community, you need to get all the value. So you have to reduce all or most of the diesel. When I see Peter Kirby here from Atlan and Tucker River Tlingit, I really hope you've got some of your sweet salmon for me here, so I'll see you later. Is you've got to go with the whole community, and so you're going to get all the value. If you maximize the reduction of diesel, you get value. And the first thing to me is affordable heat. We need to have the level of support and resourcing to change that infrastructure, and it will be expensive. The second thing I talked to is, and John, you mentioned this on transport, is that a lot of the diesel use is for transport. And there aren't enough, in my view, transport projects, but there's great opportunities with new fuels, both in terms of hydrogen come online, ammonia is an option. Obviously, electrical vehicles. We'll hand out after this session a new program that we have with Indigenous Clean Energy that will support communities to put EV charging stations in community. So I think transport's really important. And the third thing is this. Turtle Island is a wonderfully beautiful ecological space. But at the end of the day, it's each and every community and it's each and every jurisdiction. And I do think the path forward to catalyze the opportunities that you pointed to, Graeme, is that we need to have a different relationship between communities and provincial and territorial governments. And John, what I've seen in my experience here with the Yukon and the work of the 14 First Nations here in your government, there's been some real progress, and you noted two of the important things like the storage project with the Kwantlen First Nation and the Atlan hydro expansion and more. But I gotta be honest with you, and I'm gonna break some china. I think I need a glass to throw on the floor, that would be really good, right? Is that there are certain jurisdictions in this country, and Eileen, your question the last session highlighted it, that frankly are not changing. So the three things that I note is, let's move with alacrity, with the kind of scale of infrastructure resourcing for affordable heat. Let's look at our transport infrastructure so that we are really moving to renewable sources there. And laterally, there's some real changes we need in jurisdictions in the country. Judith mentioned this about her province in BC. There's positives, but folks, I'll be honest, I actually think the federal government, and Anita, I like your words and Andre's words, I think you've listened a lot to us. But what I hear in the way when I travel around Turtle Island is I gotta say a few provincial jurisdictions, and that's provincial governments, regulators, and utilities, we need you to be part of our story on the part of reconciliation. Thanks.
Great point, yeah. I like those three things: heat, transport, and relationships, all of which can go together. So Linda, in addition to running Pembina, is also a member of the Net Zero Advisory Body, the body that helps inform the federal government in respecting a key piece of its climate accountability legislation. I wonder if you could share the types of discussions you've had in the context of that body and how they would inform the clean energy transition.
Okay, thanks, Graeme. So what is the Net Zero Advisory Body, and why do we need another advisory body in Canada around the transformation to clean energy? Well, it is a new body. A little bit of background on it. Its purpose, as Graeme said, is a bit of a watchdog to hold the federal government accountable for its commitments to transform energy systems to get to net zero emissions by 2050. As I say, a bit of a watchdog type group, but we also have a mandate to provide advice to the federal government. For example, the 2030 emissions reduction plan that Graeme also mentioned that was released a couple of weeks ago by Minister Guilbeault, we provided some advice into that plan, and we'll be monitoring how the federal government is implementing the plan. And Chris, whether or not they're working with the provinces, the territories, and Indigenous governments in that implementation. I also want to make sure that you're aware that Chief Kluani Adamak is also a member of the Net Zero Advisory Board. So she's, as you know, the AFN Regional Chief for the Yukon. So there we have some good Indigenous leadership on the board as well. She would have liked to have been here today, but there's, I think some of you know, there's another major First Nations project coalition conference going on in Vancouver right now, and Chief Kluani is attending that. But what she has done, and we're still a fairly new group getting used to working with each other, but she has invited the full advisory board to come to the Yukon and the North this summer and to spend time in community to learn more about the needs and the priorities and the opportunities that are here. So we do intend to be taking up Chief Kluani on that opportunity. So if you're interested in connecting with this organization, just speak to her. You can speak to me, and I can provide you with more information about what's going to be happening there. My sense of, of where things are going in terms of the thinking on the advisory body and the opportunities in the 2030 emissions reduction plan is that, as you've heard from all of the other speakers, the focus is very much now shifting to regional and to the regional and community level, and integrated approaches to power, heating, and transportation. I think that those are going to be priorities, and embedding responsibility and authority in communities. Again, these are major themes in the 2030 emissions reduction plan, so you're going to be hearing more about them as well. So my thinking on this, you've heard from the other speakers about how best to, there's a lot of change happening. There's lots going on. There's UNDRIP and Indigenous rights and reconciliation, utilities reform. There's new mechanisms emerging locally and globally to finance clean energy projects, and also the human capital and capacity development that are part of it. The challenge is going to be to navigate all of the change that is occurring in this space right now. And as Chris was saying earlier, the key to that is going to be to know what you want to do. And as we heard from this table here this morning, communicate, network, build those partnerships, and communicate the results of this conference and the one that's going on in Vancouver this week as well, that Chief Kluani is at, and work with groups like the Net Zero Advisory Body to get your priorities out there and to get your projects and capacities funded. Thank you.
Yeah, let's get a round of applause for all 5 of our speakers. So miigwech for all of you. I think we might switch gears just a little bit. So I had mentioned 3 rounds of questions. I think we'll just do one more round of questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So in the next 15 minutes or so, hopefully kind of ideas or questions can percolate, and you'll feel comfortable to ask those. So this part, we're gonna chunk it. We're gonna have a question for our federal and territorial representatives, and then a question for Chris and Linda. And so potentially we'll start with you, Minister. Just after sharing those updates, obviously we spoke in the last panel a little about the ongoing journey. So we'd be interested in knowing what else you think needs to be done to support Indigenous leadership in accelerating the clean energy transition. And then we'll go to Anita and André.
Thanks. I'll give 2 thoughts, and I'll build my first one on what Chris mentioned about affordable heat. If we get into our communities, and if the communities work to insulate better, right, then we don't need as much energy. And so, and the federal government under NRCan just recently announced some funding for building capacity within communities around energy auditors and that type of work. So I think that's really great, because that technology, that whole, is very transferable, it's very distributable, and it's just going to reduce our needs. So it's an efficiency move, and I think it can be community-led. And so, but my main first topic is just about building capacity. I had a conversation with Al yesterday about the challenges around capacity within our communities, what we need to do to try and build it. So I think there's all sorts of fronts where this needs to happen. I look to Yukon University here in the territory, and I'm sure there's other partner organizations across the country that would help to build that capacity. So that's the first one, is capacity in our communities. And the second one builds on what you said, Linda, which I completely agree with, and that is that we need, as governments, we need to get to our communities. Forget the communities coming to us, we need to get to our communities. We need to walk on the land, we need to talk to folks in the communities, we need to be there, we need to take time to get to know the community. I think it's always seems like it's set up the other way around, where people have to come to us as a territorial government or the feds, and if we run it the other way, I just think we're going to have much better success, and it's going to be more meaningful for the communities themselves. So, Graeme, my two thoughts are support building capacity, and get to the community itself to be there with it.
Great. Thanks, Minister. One more to align with Chris's three things, but let's go to Anita maybe, and then we'll go to André.
Thanks. So, yeah, I have two things as well. I'm following Chris's lead. Three things. But just looking at, I think federally, we really need to apply that Indigenous leadership lens to the work we do, and recognize that Indigenous communities really know what needs to be done. They are on the ground, they are in the community, and they know what their priorities are, what their opportunities are. In Ottawa, we are far removed from that. So, and what does that look like if we're really applying an Indigenous leadership lens and putting those values into the work that we do? I think it looks like having more accessible programming that communities can find us and access the money, and we are flexible. It looks like supporting self-determined priorities. It looks like putting communities first and centering them in the work that we do, and building relationships with communities. And so, you know, that's a tall order, and we're committed to working towards that in the new programming that we have moving forward. Secondly, though, I think we have huge ambitious targets over the next while, and this is like an all hands on deck situation where we need all of the partners at the table. Federal government cannot do this by themselves. Communities cannot do this by themselves. We need feds, we need provinces and territories, we need ICE at the table, we need Indigenous governments and organizations, and everybody to be working through how we advance some of these projects and how we line ourselves up funding-wise and technology-wise, and making sure that we're aware of some of those barriers. You know, when your construction season hits, when your shipping season hits, how do we make sure that supplies are delivered on time, and shovels are getting in the ground? And I think we've had a really good example over the last year with the Atlan Hydro Expansion Project, of having everybody around the table together to talk through that funding timeline and what are the opportunities, and we've been able to you know, collectively say, here are the opportunities, and move that project forward with funding. And I think we need to look at that broader scale for individual community projects, but also just large scale. How do we advance clean energy transformation across the north? Because we know there's significant challenges there that are going to require a team effort. And at CERNAC, we have some funding now as well to be supporting planning and feasibility of some of these large hydro projects, and this is going to be years that we need to be working together to really push these forward. So, thanks.
Yeah, Anita. André?
Thanks very much, Anita. Thanks, Graeme. And I think I think I'm building on the points that have already been made. So more for emphasis, I would say. it feels like there's a strong agreement that keeping communities at the center of our conversations is critical to supporting Indigenous leadership. I'd acknowledge, Chris, your point on the financial side of it. Make sure you let the Minister of Finance know what the needs are there. But it's certainly not just money. How we work together is a really big part of, I think, supporting successful Indigenous leadership. From my perspective, that means that it's our responsibility to focus on what our partners need. That means promoting access and enhancing flexibility. I think as well that on the from a federal perspective, we're often, I think our attention sometimes is tugged more towards the short term, especially in the context of the electoral cycle. But we need to treat this as a marathon and not a sprint. And maintaining good relationships and having those relationships as anchors to our approach is, I think, critical to our ability to support others. And then looking over the horizon line, from our perspective, supporting greater and greater Indigenous climate leadership is the end point. And we've heard capacity building a few different times. Couldn't agree more that that's part of building the foundation for greater Indigenous climate leadership. And I don't think as a federal civil servant that I want to say what that looks like exactly. I think it's critical that we stay in learning and listening mode. One of the things that I'd want to mention is that as Anita and I bring our efforts closer together, along with other federal efforts, we'll be establishing an Indigenous Advisory Council to help guide and shape our work, to make sure that we keep that as a really strong, integrated part of how we make decisions. And I think at some point it also means that we as federal public servants need to be ready to take a step back, and supporting Indigenous leadership also means creating more space for others. So the future perhaps means that for panels like this, there'll be less folks like me from Ottawa, more voices who are coming at it from a different perspective. Thanks.
Awesome, Miigwech, André. Let's shift gears. We'll go to Chris and Linda. Very similar question. In your perspective, what additional steps does government need to take, and what role do other organizations play? And I think we heard a little bit about that collaboration and all partners from Anita. Chris?
Thanks, Graeme. Puck, I forgot what I was going to say. A little bit of humor goes a long way in the change process we got to go through, right? I think relationship is the core of our ability to change. And, but sometimes with some governments or some government entities, they aren't at the table. I'm really grateful for those that are here. But I think we need to say in very frank terms, and I'm throwing a glass of China on the floor, is we have to say in very frank terms to utilities and regulators and some provincial governments, you need to be in the room to forge a relationship differently. And to assume that if we are stuck in the boxes that we created in the past and we hope that the future will be different, it ain't gonna get there. And so therefore I think what we have to be a bit more assertive and a bit more blunt sometimes to say, we need relationship with you. And that's why when I see Anita here and André here and many of you in the room here, because we're in relationship with you in a different way. What I've seen in my time of working in this field for 25 or 30 years is that when I see those allies of Indigenous communities that are essential for change to be effective for clean energy and a climate-friendly future, is they understand how they change and their hearts and minds change. So what I think, Graeme, that we have to be is we have to say to someone, why aren't you here? I don't understand. Because when I look at this room, and I actually would like all of you to kind of move your heads around the room and look at others in the room for a minute. Just turn around, look at others, you can make a contact point, because you're in relationship with each other. And without the relationship, it's not what's on this podium or the stage that counts, it's relationship that counts. And so, therefore, what I think we have to be very frank is, one, thank those that are here, thank those that are in relationship. You know, sometimes we're a bit more apt to say what's wrong. I kind of like to talk about what the glass half full made it full and what we need to make it fully full. And so I want to thank those that have made the glass half full, because they have, as government officials and entities, and I think particularly provincial and territorial governments have to say to their creatures of their governments, like utilities and regulators, you need to change. I'm sorry, you just need to change. But I want to thank you for those who have made the glass half full, but to make the glass fully full for the future we're trying to seek that's just, a true just transition, we need to be in relations with others.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. Linda?
Thanks. Just following up on what Chris is saying about the need to be in the room to forge different types of relationships. What I'd add to that from the Net Zero Advisory Body perspective is the need for urgency. I have to tell you, even though we've got this mandate that says net zero by 2050, we really don't spend too much time thinking about 2050. It's now. It's 2030. We got to get there, folks. If we don't make the progress that's required on emissions reduction between now and 2030, it really won't matter what happens after 2030. And so that element of urgency, that focus on 2030, the demand for new leadership, Indigenous leadership in climate action at the regional community level, you know, the wind is up. Take advantage, move it.
Great. Thanks, Linda. Maybe another round of applause for our second round of responses. Excellent work. So as I mentioned, I think we have about 20 minutes left in the session. We have one more question that I might save to the very end for the group, but want to open up the mics. We have mics both in this room, in the multipurpose room, and virtually for our panelists. So I don't know if anybody would like to make their way to the mics, either in this room or the next room. Or even, I know there was questions on, oh, here we go. Here's a question, please.
Thank you for this panel. The largest thing that I see for Indigenous remote communities is we are still subsidizing fossil fuels in our communities. We need to, I've got the note right here. We need to cut fossil fuel subsidies and put that money towards dismantling the fossil fuel industry in our communities. When I saw that, all of that fossil fuels, there are many companies who will not let you take away their market. We need to address this. And it's only the national government that can do this. You're the ones who say yes to a new oil platform when we don't need any more oil. You're the ones who say yes to expanding the tar sands when we don't want, we need to shut down the tar sands. These are all Indigenous lands that are being destroyed for fossil fuels. We need to stop this. We need to base our economies of the future on dismantling the fossil fuel enterprise that is everywhere in the north. There's abandoned oil drums in the most remote communities. Still, there's buried tanks, but nobody knows where they are. This is we think of all the money that has been, and most of us in remote communities, we don't pay our bills because there's some other entity paying our bill when it comes to fossil fuel. This is a codependent relationship that the government has had with the fossil fuel industry for the last 70 years. So that needs to stop. And I'm so glad you mentioned wind, because with climate change, the wind is getting stronger. And that's the biggest gap in the last 25 years, that wind has been denied to be developed in the north. And I think we have a really awesome opportunity to turn that around. And I'm just really happy everybody is able to gather again and hear these words from our elders. And we have a big job ahead of us to dismantle our fossil fuel country. Thank you.
Yeah, miigwech for that. Any panelists want to respond to that?
Sally said it.
All right, why don't we go to our next question, and then we'll see if there's any responses, please.
Hi. At our last conference here in Whitehorse, it was really highlighted the need to build capacity within all our rural communities, not just both Indigenous but non-Indigenous. Since that time, the federal government has definitely changed their approach on funding the Northreach program, which I'm glad to see. I was hoping it would move a lot faster than it is, but it's still moving ahead. The one problem I do see is the development of the leadership skills within our rural communities. We have very small populations. In a lot of the communities, it's an older population. They don't have the energy that they used to have, and maybe not the understanding how to approach funding applications, to put together leadership. You know, the one program that I think all of us could really benefit is the Catalyst program that, you know, trains community members how to become leaders. But we have to package that so that it becomes a framework for every community out there as a starting point to put together the skills of someone within their community to say, we've got to do this, and also gain the support of the community behind them so they don't feel like they're left out on a limb. So I guess what I want to know, we are providing money for capacity building, but are we developing a framework of how to develop the leadership skills for those people who need to have the capacity to move our communities forward?
Great, miigwech for the question. Chris, you want to start, and then Minister?
Yeah, totally with you. And, you know, I think those catalysts are a pain in the ass, though. Let me say the ones that are here, they're problematic. That's like, no, you're right. I mean, but one of the things that we've done with Indigenous Clean Energy is to strengthen that so that you have the Catalyst program, you have the Generation Power program that places young people in employment, you have Imagination, you have Bringing Home that's helping build capacity on energy efficiency and housing. What we've actually concluded to be effective, because at the end of the day, we have to get impact, actual impact of projects that are truly abundant. And so therefore, we feel that sometimes it needs 3, 4, 5 people in the community building a team together. And so I think capacity is true. Catalyst is a part of it, but let's build more impact, and not just on the part of our organization, but many organizations, and some of you in this room and in the multipurpose room. So more people in communities supporting each other with some of the base of support for a several-year period is really, really important. But more capacity that is sustained.
Thanks, Chris.
I'll just add a little bit. Thanks, Al, for the question and the thought. And Shane André's in the back for the Yukon and with the Energy Solution Center. And I think there is an element of train the trainer when we're talking about the energy auditors so that we can keep it moving into our communities further. The other thing I want to mention, and I know that, or certainly my communities are getting older, I know that, but I will tell you that every week I get pitched by some young folks with ideas. So there is a lot of innovation which is coming now, and of course I can't handle all of it, and we redirect it where we can, but there is a lot of renewable energy around the whole issue, which I think is very positive. And I don't know that I'm tapping into all of it, but I think there's more than I had expected when I got into this role.
Yeah, excellent. And just before we go to the question, I also just want to acknowledge yesterday's session that was organized by Dakota and a few others of our Indigenous young leaders that are here now, and hopefully we'll have space for them in the next program. Yeah, please, on the mic here. And then I do want to also check in the multi-purpose room after this question.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Jordan. I'm from northern Saskatchewan. I work for the Métis Nation, but I also represent ICE and 7Gen here. I just have a question around jurisdiction. So we talk a lot about where the utility fits in this, but why is there such a disconnect? Like, we look at the duty to consult process with the Métis Nation, for example, where the big disconnect is at a federal level to a provincial level. Whose responsibility is that, and why is it like so easily pitched back and forth? Like we have Bill C-92 that's supposed to protect land, and that's new legislation, but all of these old projects are just grandfathered in and get to go and do exactly all the things that they have been doing. So why doesn't our new legislation actually protect what it's supposed to protect? I'm just curious if there's something that I'm missing, or if that's actually just meant to upset the system in that way, that it's actually providing opportunity for development to just continue. So I'm just curious on your perspective on that.
Yeah, maybe it's Jordan. Anyone want to respond to that quickly? John?
Thank you, Jordan. There's always inertia in systems. Sorry, I've lost you. Where are you? Oh, there. Hi. Thank you, Jordan. This is truly a challenge, and I think it's pretty fair to criticize politicians, because sometimes we'll pass the buck to another order of government. And it's not helpful, right? Like, we need to bring everybody together and take responsibility. And I love when we get together and just talk about how to make things happen, not about how they need to be the way they were, or even to Sally's question about fossil fuel subsidies. So if we're talking about legislation, though, sometimes those things take time to move through the system. They're not as fast. When I talk to folks, young folks, they're like, well, why don't you do this today? I remember being at a youth conference at the United Nations on climate change, and someone stood up and said, oh my God, we've been talking about this for a whole hour. And I just thought, oh, I'd already been working on the issue for decades. So legislation is tough sometimes, and I think it's important that governments work together to deal with the problem. Sorry, I don't know your bill that you're referring to specifically, but we have our own, like for legislation for our environmental assessments. So it can be challenging, but I think it's important to hold governments together to account.
I said Bill C-92, that's child and family.
Yeah.
That's totally wrong. I meant Bill C-69. Yeah. That totally has to do with development, sorry.
All good, all good.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's Jordan. Why don't we go one in this room, Mr. Nirsu, and then we'll go to the multi-purpose room.
Oh my goodness, you even remember my name. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Jordan. Thank those that have spoken. If I might make a couple of comments and then maybe ask about the approaches on policy. First of all, I want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Atlan and the Kwantlen, on which I stand. Thank you for the ceremony of inviting us here, and those that are organizing the conference, thank you very much. I just want to say, start with one thing. Just be reminded that Indigenous people is not in the communities. All of the land is Indigenous land. And we share it together. And I think from that perspective, if we teach that history, that we're not taking something away from each other, but rather we're sharing our experience, our knowledge, and our future. I think we always have to see it that way. The other thing that I wanted to say is that we all come from different communities with different experiences. The irony is that many of the experiences are exactly the same. I think it's more about defining and determining how we move forward on addressing the concerns we have at the community level. One thing that was mentioned earlier about government role, I think too often jurisdiction gets in the way of success. And here's why. Many of the Indigenous communities here don't need another government or a middleman in between them and the Government of Canada in many respects. And too often money is flowed through other agencies before it gets to the community, and by the time it gets to the community, it is not what they expected to receive. And I make that point because people we always have to respect that our leaders and the people in our community know what their needs are. And too often in the process of bringing money through mechanisms, we get involved in fighting over the money, community versus community, rather than addressing the needs of those people that are in the community. And I think we got to find a way to create the mechanisms that do the best. The comment that was made about the Indigenous off-diesel and the Catalyst program. I'm very grateful that Canada created that mechanism because it creates a process where the community is working directly with Canada addressing the needs of communities. It's not in any way to disrespect the province or the territory, but there is a need for people to understand and to recognize that our people, our Indigenous community, are knowledgeable, they have history, and they understand the needs, and they need the experts, the scientists, the researchers, and the technicians to come into the community to implement their ideas and their thoughts and their dreams. And I think in an event like this, always understand that at the end of the day, whatever happens needs to be owned by the people and the communities that are impacted by the actions that you're taking. I was thinking earlier about the comment about safe communities, secure communities, and sustainable communities. It's often difficult for people in smaller communities to feel safe about their security as a community, both and sustainable, because they're always competing with larger centers to take money from them. I'm thinking about my colleagues, my friends from Polituck, and for some of the Delaunay and some of the Arctic communities, they live where they do, not because they want to compete with you, but they want to, that's their home. And so we need to think about that we're not competing with you. We're simply living where we believe we should live. And I needed to say that because it's the same thing reverse, where people want sustainable energy, they want secure energy, and they want safe energy. So any initiatives that we take is based on that concept. So thank you very much.
Oh, Rich. Yeah, so we're going to go to the multi-purpose room and see if there are any questions in that room.
Oh, thank you. Yes, we do have 2 questions. Would you like to start us off with the first question?
Thanks very much. My name is Sarah Newton. I'm with the Climate Reality Project. I'll be working with the Yukon Research Center this summer. My question is around that decolonization space because from my perspective, I look at all of the big decision makers and we're talking about like utilities and other corporations that are like holding a lot of the power and holding a lot of this inertia in place. So I'd really like to know like where the puck are we going with the decolonization? Like here we are, I hear the federal government like putting communities first. I really love what they were saying about the Northern Access Program and Northern Reach and working with Liard First Nation, I recognize all the challenges we had with one-year funding projects, and I know I don't have to tell all of you guys about how that all, you know, it's just so impossible to plan anything. But like what can we do going forward? If we're here now and there's been so much progress over the last 10 years that I've been in this space, like what is next for us? Like how can we further decolonize these spaces, and how do we bring like our whole selves forward? How can we be in better relationship with utility boards? How can we be in better relationship with corporations so that there's like more of an exchange of power, more of an exchange and dialogue, as opposed to just like all this inertia and embedded racism?
Awesome. Miigwech, why don't we take the other question in that room as well, and then we'll turn to our panelists to respond.
Great, thank you. Tim Weiss, I'm with the University of Alberta, formerly with the Famine Institute. And so it's exciting to see an organization or a conference like this, having been part of them from a few decades ago and seeing how large it's grown. I think whether we like it or not, the federal government is involved, or it needs to be involved in these types of programs. And I think it's fair to say that the current government has been very supportive of these remote community renewables. Maybe not perfect, but I think it's fair to say that definitely been more supportive than we've seen in the past. So my question is specific to what do we do sort of long term? We know these projects take a long time, and we know, as Dave Lovekin pointed out earlier, that we have a long way to go. So what types of policies or programs can we be asking for, developing, or thinking about that sort of create that long-term resilience, or that long-term thinking that so we're not just sort of following ebbs and flows of specific governments or specific political whims, but how do we sort of create that resiliency, I guess, is the heart of my question. Thanks.
Great, Miigwech, Tim. So why don't we, I think we're going to go through all 5 panelists to respond to those 2 questions as our final kind of responses. And so maybe we'll start with André and then finish with our 4 panelists in the room.
Thanks very much, Graeme, and again, really appreciate the opportunity to be with you virtually. So many things to reflect on from the discussion, and I wish I were there to take it in person, because I can tell just from some of the points being made that there's a rich conversation that's preceded this panel, and I'm sure will come after as well. I think I could acknowledge the point made by Sarah on decolonization. There's, I think, a lot of reflection to think about what it will take to create Indigenous climate leadership in practice, or help create it, and that decolonization needs to be part of that. An active consideration, Tim, the point you made about the role the Government of Canada can play, but also how to make that sustainable. Certainly, that's something we've reflected on as we've designed our programming. And part of it is not just design, but also longevity. And this, to me, ties to the point on relationships. So just looking forward to the rest of the conference, one thing that I'd stress is that we're able to be a partner for you right now. The federal government does have resources that can help support your ideas and your projects, so please don't be shy about approaching my colleagues from the federal government and ask them how we can help put tools in your hands and be better partners. But as I said at the beginning, we ourselves have a lot of learning to do, and so I'm eager to see how not just the conversation goes at the conference, but how it unfolds over the months and years to come, so that we can keep learning and get better at this. But thanks again, really appreciative of the opportunity to be a part of this conversation.
Great, Miigwech, André. Let's go to you, Chris, and then we'll go to Linda.
Yeah, very briefly, Sarah, on your question on decolonization, I'd encourage all of you to tap into the Decolonizing Power podcasts that Freddie Hoopé Campbell and James Basasho and Harper, who's here, are the hosts of. And they're about to start airing the 2nd season of Stories, which talks about how, in fact, we go through those changes. And Tim, I think your point about structured change is really important. That's multi-year. I'm really gratified to see how CERC has a multi-year process, and we need to do that on a consistent basis. And my final point, Graeme, is that if you're here for the first time thinking about how this works for your community, what's the first step? Don't feel intimidated. Come and talk to anybody else, because it's when you join that our steps become truly impactful. So don't say, oh, gee, I don't know how to do that, or I don't know what my question is. Everyone here is approachable. We're all in the change together. Thanks.
Great. Miigwech, Chris. Linda?
Thanks. Yes. Well, on decolonization, I'm going to listen to that Freddie and James's podcast. I haven't heard it yet, so that's a good place to start. But I think we're all here today because we believe that embedding Indigenous leadership and autonomy into energy transition is part of that pathway on decolonization. And so the discussions that are going on here and elsewhere across Canada, and truthfully elsewhere in the world right now, because it's not just Canada, as you heard earlier from the chief on the first panel today. It is a global look for leadership to Indigenous communities on climate action. So that's one point. The other point in relation to Tim's question about long-term planning, yes, it is difficult, but I'll just go back to my previous exhortation. I think 2030 is about as long-term as we want to be able to look out right now, and we have to pull every technological, social lever and capital lever that's possible between now and 2030 to get there.
Thanks, everyone. For Chris, I just want to let you know there's a lake north of town called Fox Lake, and so there's a saying in the Yukon for Fox Lake. So if you can take that and use that elsewhere. It's one of our ways of, passing the puck. And André had a comment earlier about this being a marathon, and I get why he says that, but I'm more with Linda on this, that right now I feel it's a sprint. It is a marathon and it's a sprint, and we've got to make ground right now. There's a lot of work to do, and thank you to everyone who is doing work in your communities. I'll go to Tim's question first, just very quickly. One of the ways that we're going to deal with this is to bring in a Clean Energy Act, like Denmark, like BC. And why do we do that? It's to make a commitment to the Yukon that we have to transition. And it's not that there's some form of enforcement. It just says, yes, we have to do this. So there's ways to try and get beyond the next election cycle. And to use that same thought around the utility board that we have here right now, I'm working with Jay Massey, who spoke to you yesterday as in part of the intro, to talk about our electricity rates for Yukoners right now to make sure that electricity is affordable. But at the same time, we need to review how the utility board works and the model that's behind it and underneath it, and modernize it for the sprint and the marathon that we're in right now. And we're going to do that work. So happy to talk to you about that more. Sarah.
Yeah, thanks everybody for the wonderful reflections and questions today. I think this is all in my trying to put it all together. I think it all fits under this this theme of Indigenous leadership, and how do we build this out? And I think it's one thing to have those words that we have, we've been talking about that all day so far, and but what does that really mean in action? And I think it's looking at things like, fossil fuel subsidies and bringing capacity to communities and across communities as well, and looking at decolonization efforts and how do we move forward on that? It's really bringing Indigenous partners to the table, making sure that Indigenous partners are part of all of those conversations that we're having federally, that feds are having with provinces and territories, and making sure that you have a seat there and a meaningful voice so that we can start to kind of work through these questions and these barriers. And when we look at things like UNDRIP, not just committing to something, but actually implementing it. How do we take it to the next step and really start to implement? So I think this is the beginning of a really good conversation. Looking forward to hearing more thoughts over the next couple of days.
Awesome. Yeah, miigwech, and give a round of applause to everybody. And I know I'm in between you and the break, and I just wanted to say two final things. I actually want another round of applause maybe for all the Indigenous leaders in the room currently. I think if anything, we heard why we need to do that. We need to do And then finally, just point to some of the other sessions that we have later this afternoon that I feel like will pick up many of these threads that were introduced, especially around the concept of Indigenous climate leadership. So, Chimigwich for all of the questions for our panelists, and have a good break. And I think Dave will probably share more about that quickly. Yeah.